Spring 1945, Pennsylvania. As Germany's collapse accelerated, thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers and medical staff crossed the Atlantic as prisoners, destined for American detention camps far from burning European cities. Few expected what awaited them behind the wire. The morphine was gone. The sulfa powder had run out weeks ago. Dr. Karl Weber had watched 19 men die from infections that should have been survivable, their wounds festering in field hospitals where bandages were boiled and reused until they fell apart. Now, in an American prison camp, he stood before shelves stocked with medicines he had only read about in journals from before the war. This was the story his superiors never prepared him for. The enemy was supposed to be brutal. Instead, they were handing him vials of penicillin and asking if he needed more. Weber's hands trembled as he held the small ampule up to the light. Everything he had been told was a lie. The transport ship pitched through gray Atlantic swells, and Karl Weber pressed his forehead against the cold metal bulkhead, willing his stomach to settle. Around him in the hold, captured German soldiers and medical personnel sat in resigned silence, the kind that comes after surrender when words feel too expensive to waste. He had been a military doctor for 4 years, moving from field hospital to field hospital across France, and then the desperate retreat through the Rhineland. Now he was cargo, bound for a country he had been taught to despise. The propaganda films had shown American soldiers as uncultured savages, their cities corrupt, their medicine primitive compared to German scientific superiority. Yet the young American guard who brought them water twice daily spoke careful, textbook German, and offered extra rations to the seasick without being asked. Weber noticed but said nothing. Below deck, the smell was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, rust, and the faint sweetness of vomit that no amount of scrubbing could erase from the wooden boards. Ingrid Bauer, a nurse who had worked under Weber in a Munich hospital before being transferred to a field unit, sat with her back straight despite exhaustion. She had always possessed that quality, a refusal to let circumstances diminish her. Her uniform was stained and worn, but she had somehow kept her Red Cross armband pristine. When a young soldier near her began weeping quietly, she moved to sit beside him and said nothing, just rested her hand on his shoulder. Weber watched her and felt something crack inside his chest. They had lost. That fact was inescapable now. But what came next? The propaganda had promised that captured Germans would be worked to death, starved, tortured. Yet here they were, given blankets, fed twice a day with something resembling real food. It did not align. The journey lasted 11 days, each one blurring into the next until time felt elastic and meaningless. Weber spent hours staring at his hands that had performed hundreds of surgeries with inadequate tools and dwindling supplies. He had amputated limbs with saws meant for carpentry. He had stitched wounds with thread pulled from uniforms. He had held boys as they died from infections that modern medicine should have prevented, whispering lies about how they would be fine, how reinforcements were coming, how Germany was still winning. The lies had stopped working somewhere around October 1944, when even the youngest soldiers understood the war was lost. Now, crossing an ocean toward imprisonment, Weber wondered if he would ever practice medicine again, or if his hands would be put to labor in American fields. The thought should have frightened him more than it did. Mostly, he just felt tired. On the 12th morning, someone shouted that land was visible. The prisoners crowded toward the small portholes, pressing against each other for a glimpse of America. Weber stayed seated. He had no desire to see the country that had defeated them. But Ingrid came to him with an expression he could not quite read. Not fear, not hope. Something more complicated. "Doctor," she said quietly, "whatever happens now, we are still physicians. We still have that." He wanted to tell her that titles meant nothing anymore, that they were prisoners and would be treated as such. Instead, he nodded and stood because she was right. Whatever else had been stripped away, the Hippocratic Oath remained. They were healers even here, even now. The ship docked in New York Harbor at dawn, and they were processed quickly, photographed, tagged, loaded onto trains heading west. Through the windows, Weber watched American cities pass, vast and undamaged, their factories running, their people walking streets that had never known bombardment. It was obscene, this abundance, this normalcy, while Europe burned. But beneath the anger, something else stirred. an uncomfortable recognition that perhaps the propaganda had inverted reality, that perhaps Germany had been the aggressor all along. He pushed the thought away. It was too large, too terrible to examine closely. Not yet. Fort Indiantown Gap sprawled across Pennsylvania hills, with an efficiency that would have impressed German military planners. The POW section was separated from the main base by wire fencing and guard towers, but inside the compound, the conditions defied everything Weber had expected. Barracks were clean, heated against the March cold, equipped with real beds and blankets. A mess hall served meals that, while simple, were plentiful and hot. He kept waiting for the cruelty to begin, for the guards to reveal their true nature. Instead, they were professionally distant but not brutal. One guard, a young corporal with a thick southern accent, even joked with the prisoners in broken German, laughing at his own grammatical mistakes. Weber did not know how to process kindness from an enemy. The medical clinic sat at the compound's eastern edge, a long wooden building with a red cross painted on the roof. When Weber and Ingrid were escorted there on their third day, he expected to find something resembling the field hospitals he had worked in. Makeshift, undersupplied, desperate. Instead, they walked into a space that looked more like a university teaching hospital than a prison camp facility. The examination rooms had proper lighting, running water, stainless steel tables. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with bandages, antiseptics, surgical instruments still in sterile packaging. Weber stopped walking and simply stared. Ingrid made a small sound beside him, something between a gasp and a laugh. They had not seen supplies like this since 1942, perhaps 1941. Maybe never. Captain John Anderson emerged from a back office, a tall man in his 40s with silver threading through his dark hair and deep lines around his eyes that suggested too many sleepless nights. He introduced himself in careful German, then switched to English and waited while a translator relayed his words. "You are both medical professionals," Anderson said. "We have over 2,000 prisoners in this camp. Many arrived malnourished, some with untreated wounds or illnesses. We need your help." Weber felt the words as a physical shock. They were offering him work, real work, the chance to practice medicine again. Ingrid looked at him, seeking permission or perhaps confirmation that this was real. He nodded slowly. What choice did they have? But also, and this thought arrived unbidden, what reason was there to refuse? Anderson led them through the clinic, explaining protocols and procedures with the same thoroughness Weber had once used teaching medical students. There were wards for infectious diseases, a small surgical theater, even a dental office. The American doctor opened a locked cabinet, revealing rows of glass vials with typed labels. "Penicillin," Anderson said simply. "We have enough for treatment courses. I will show you proper administration techniques." Weber reached out without thinking, picking up one of the vials with the reverence one might handle a religious relic. Penicillin had been discovered by a British scientist, Fleming, but mass production had been an Allied achievement during the war. German forces had almost no access to it. Weber had read about it in confiscated journals, seen the miraculous recovery rates, mourned every patient he lost to infections that penicillin could have cured. Now here it was, shelf after shelf, and an American was offering to teach him how to use it. That night, lying in his bunk while other prisoners snored or whispered in the darkness, Weber could not sleep. His mind kept returning to the clinic, to those shelves, to Anderson's calm assumption that of course they would share medical knowledge, that of course prisoners deserved proper treatment. Everything he had been taught about Americans, that they were weak, decadent, racially inferior, crumbled against the reality of that clinic. He thought about the boys he had watched die, their faces blurring together now into one composite ghost. How many could have been saved with penicillin? The question was unbearable, but he could not stop asking it. Somewhere in the barracks, someone coughed wetly, a pneumonia sound. In the morning, Weber would bring him to the clinic. He would use penicillin. He would save a life. The irony was not lost on him. American medicine saving a German soldier who had tried to kill Americans. War made no sense. Perhaps it never had. Corporal Helen Brooks had a smile that seemed incongruous with her surroundings, warm and genuine in a place defined by containment and watchfulness. She was younger than Ingrid, perhaps 25, with auburn hair pinned back in regulation style, and hands that moved with practiced confidence. When she demonstrated how to properly reconstitute penicillin powder, mixing it with sterile water in precise ratios, Ingrid watched with the attention of a devoted student. "The key is slow injection," Helen explained through the translator, though her gestures made the meaning clear even before words arrived. "Too fast and it causes pain, possible complications. We take our time." She spoke to Ingrid as an equal, one nurse to another, and something in Ingrid's posture shifted. Less guarded, more present. Over the following weeks, the clinic became a space outside normal prison camp dynamics. Inside those walls, nationality mattered less than competence and the shared language of medicine. Weber worked alongside Anderson on a difficult appendectomy, their hands moving in synchronized rhythm, despite having never operated together before. The surgery was successful, the young prisoner recovering without infection thanks to post-operative penicillin. Afterward, Anderson clapped Weber on the shoulder, a casual gesture of respect between colleagues, and said, "You have excellent technique. Where did you train?" Weber answered automatically, describing his years at university in Heidelberg, his residency in Berlin. The moment he realized surgery was his calling, only later did he recognize the strangeness of the conversation. They had been speaking as doctors, not as victor and vanquished. The smell of antiseptic became familiar again, comforting in its sharpness. Weber found himself arriving at the clinic early, staying late, losing himself in the work. There was a diabetic prisoner requiring careful insulin management, a case of suspected tuberculosis that needed isolation and treatment, minor injuries from the work details that required stitching. Each patient was treated with the same standard of care, the same access to medicine. No one was turned away because supplies were low. No one died because penicillin was being hoarded for more important soldiers. The abundance was staggering, but more staggering was the philosophy behind it, that every life had equal value, that healing was not rationed by politics or race. Weber had thought he believed that once before the war. Now he was remembering what it felt like to practice medicine according to principle rather than scarcity. Ingrid spent her days learning from Helen, absorbing techniques for wound care, blood transfusion protocols, even basic physical therapy exercises for recovering patients. The American nurse had a gift for teaching, breaking down complex procedures into manageable steps, encouraging questions without judgment. One afternoon, Ingrid asked through the translator why Americans were sharing such advanced medical knowledge with their enemies. Helen looked genuinely confused by the question. "You are nurses," she said slowly. "When you return to Germany, you will treat German patients. Why would we not want you to have the best techniques? Medicine should not have borders." The statement was so matter-of-fact, so absent of propaganda or ulterior motive, that Ingrid felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, but Helen had noticed. The American woman reached out and squeezed Ingrid's hand briefly, a small gesture of solidarity that required no translation. By April, the clinic had become the most functional part of the camp, a model that other POW facilities reportedly sought to replicate. Weber heard through the translator that Anderson had written reports praising the German medical personnel, recommending they be given greater autonomy and resources. It was disorienting, being praised by the enemy, having your skills valued when you expected to be degraded. One evening, as they locked the clinic for the night, Weber asked Anderson directly without waiting for translation because he had learned enough English by then to fumble through. "Why treat us so well? We were your enemy." Anderson was quiet for a long moment, his face thoughtful in the fading light. Then he replied, "Because the war is over for you, and because you are a doctor. That matters more than which flag you fought under." The words settled over Weber like a judgment and an absolution both. He walked back to the barracks in silence, too full of conflicting emotions to speak. Summer arrived with Pennsylvania humidity that made the clinic air thick and close despite open windows. Weber had been working in the camp for 4 months now, and the rhythm of it had become natural. Morning rounds, treatment protocols, surgical cases when necessary, teaching younger German medics basic procedures. He no longer startled at American kindness or efficiency. What had once seemed impossible now felt normal, and that normalization frightened him more than the initial shock. If Americans were not the monsters he had been taught to hate, then what did that make him? What did that make Germany? The questions circled in his mind like scavengers, picking at the corpse of his former certainty. A letter arrived from his wife in July, forwarded through Red Cross channels with agonizing slowness. She was alive, living with her sister in what remained of Cologne, surviving on rations and Allied charity. The city was rubble, the country was occupied, but she was alive, and somehow she had learned he was alive too, and that knowledge sustained her. She wrote about trying to rebuild, about the difficulty of finding food, about the German civilians slowly coming to terms with what their government had done. "They are showing us films," she wrote, "of the camps, the concentration camps. Carl, I did not know. I swear to you I did not know. How could we not have known?" Weber read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking harder each time. He had not known either. Or rather, he had not let himself know. There had been rumors, whispers, things that were not spoken aloud. He had chosen not to ask questions, to focus on his patience, to tell himself that politics was not his concern. Now the willful ignorance felt like complicity. He brought the letter to Anderson that evening, needing to confess to someone, to an enemy who had shown him mercy he did not deserve. The American doctor read it slowly, his expression grave, then handed it back without comment. Weber found himself speaking in broken English mixed with German, words tumbling out in a rush. "I did not know about the camps, but I should have known. I was educated, respected. I could have asked questions. I could have refused to serve. But I told myself medicine was separate from politics, that I was only healing, not harming. Was I wrong? Was my work complicit in those horrors?" His voice cracked on the final question. Anderson was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the compound where German prisoners moved between barracks in the golden evening light. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "I cannot absolve you, Carl. That is not my place. But I can tell you this, you are asking the right questions now, and that matters." The weight of it settled over Weber like physical pressure, making it hard to breathe. For years, he had believed himself to be a good man doing difficult work in terrible circumstances. Now he understood that good intentions meant nothing without moral courage, that silence in the face of evil was its own form of collaboration. He thought about all the patients he had saved during the war, the lives extended so they could go back to fighting, the soldiers he had patched up and sent back to the front. Had he helped perpetuate the war? Had his healing been a form of harm? The contradictions were insoluble, but they had to be lived with. There was no redemption available, no easy forgiveness, only the long, hard work of understanding what he had been part of and determining who he would be going forward. Ingrid found him that night sitting outside the clinic, staring at nothing. She sat beside him without speaking, her presence a quiet solidarity. Eventually, she said, "Helen showed me photographs today, of the camp liberations, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau." Her voice was hollow, scraped clean of inflection. "We wore the same uniform as the people who did that. The same cross on our armbands. How do we live with that?" Weber had no answer. They sat together in the darkness, two healers confronting the magnitude of their nation's sins, held up only by the thin hope that the work they did now, the lives they saved in this American camp, might constitute the first small steps of a lifetime atonement. It would never be enough, but it was all they had. Months later, when peace was formally declared and repatriation began, Weber stood in the clinic one final time, memorizing the smell of antiseptic, the click of glass vials, the clean efficiency of a place where medicine was practiced as it should be. Anderson found him there and handed him a small package, medical textbooks, surgical technique manuals, and 3 vials of penicillin. "For when you go home," the American said quietly, "Germany will need doctors who understand that healing has no borders, no politics, just humanity." Weber took the package with hands that had learned to be steady again, hands that had been taught mercy by the enemy, hands that would carry forward this impossible lesson, that even after the worst betrayals, after complicity and willful blindness, the work of healing could continue. He would return to the rubble of Germany and practice medicine in the shadow of atrocity, But he would practice it differently now. He would ask questions. He would refuse to look away. And he would teach every young doctor he trained that neutrality in the face of evil is itself a crime. September brought cooler air, and the first rumors of repatriation schedules being finalized. Weber threw himself into the clinic work with renewed intensity, as if by saving enough lives here, he could somehow balance the ledger of his wartime failures. A young prisoner arrived with sepsis from an untreated leg wound, the infection spreading so rapidly that amputation seemed inevitable. Anderson suggested a radical course of high-dose penicillin combined with surgical debridement, a technique still experimental but showing promise in recent American military hospitals. Weber performed the surgery with Anderson assisting, their movements synchronized through months of collaboration. They worked for 6 hours, removing necrotic tissue, flushing the wound with antiseptic solution, administering penicillin directly into the bloodstream. The boy survived with his leg intact, and Weber felt something shift inside him. Not redemption, nothing so grand, but perhaps the beginning of believing he might deserve to practice medicine again. Helen had been teaching Ingrid advanced wound care techniques, methods developed during the Pacific Theater campaigns, where infections killed as many men as enemy fire. The American nurse demonstrated negative pressure dressing applications, explaining how controlling the wound environment promoted faster healing. Ingrid absorbed everything with desperate focus, filling notebooks with sketches and notes in her precise handwriting. She knew these techniques would be vital in Germany, where supplies would be scarce and suffering immense. One afternoon, Helen presented Ingrid with a complete set of surgical instruments: scalpels, forceps, hemostats, all in a leather case that had belonged to Helen's brother, a Navy surgeon killed at Okinawa. He would want them used to save lives, Helen said simply, pressing the case into Ingrid's hands. It does not matter which lives. Ingrid held the case against her chest and wept openly, mourning Helen's brother and her own countrymen and the terrible waste of it all. The texture of the surgical instruments became familiar under Weber's fingers. The slight roughness of steel that had been sterilized countless times, the smooth click of forceps closing, the balanced weight of a scalpel designed for precision. These were tools that represented the best of human ingenuity, turned toward healing rather than harm. He thought often of the crude equipment he had used during the war, makeshift solutions born of desperation. Here everything was purpose-built, maintained, respected. The Americans treated their medical equipment the way Weber's superiors had treated weapons, as essential resources worthy of care and investment. The comparison was damning. Germany had chosen destruction over healing, had poured resources into death machines while letting field hospitals operate in medieval conditions. The choice revealed everything about the regime he had served. Anderson began inviting Weber to observe American medical innovations beyond basic treatment: rehabilitation programs for amputees, psychiatric care for soldiers with combat trauma, even early discussions of what they called holistic patient care that addressed mental and physical health simultaneously. Weber listened with the attention of a convert, understanding that he was witnessing not just superior techniques, but a fundamentally different philosophy of medicine. The Americans believed healing extended beyond the physical body, that a doctor's responsibility included the patient's dignity, mental state, and reintegration into society. It was medicine as Weber had once dreamed of practicing it, before war and ideology had corrupted everything. Now, in this prison camp of all places, he was learning what medicine could be when practiced with adequate resources and genuine humanitarian principles. By October, Weber had assisted in over 300 procedures, treated countless infections that would have been fatal without penicillin, and learned techniques that would take years to disseminate through post-war German medical schools. But more than technical knowledge, he had learned humility, the recognition that German medicine was not inherently superior, that arrogance had blinded him to his own ignorance, that true healing required setting aside ego and nationalism in service of the patient. One evening, Anderson asked Weber what he planned to do after repatriation. "Teach," Weber answered immediately. "Train a new generation of German doctors who understand that medicine belongs to humanity, not to any nation or ideology." And never forget what happens when doctors serve politics instead of patients. Anderson nodded, satisfied. The older man had seen something in Weber worth cultivating, had invested time and knowledge not because it benefited America, but because it served the larger cause of human healing. That gift, that faith, was the heaviest burden Weber would carry home. November arrived with early frost that made the compound grounds crystalline in morning light. Repatriation lists were posted weekly now, names called in groups of 50 to prepare for transport back to Germany. The camp's population was slowly shrinking, men disappearing overnight to board ships that would reverse their Atlantic crossing and deposit them in a country most no longer recognized. Weber's name had not appeared yet, and he felt conflicting emotions about the delay. Guilt at wanting to stay longer in this place of learning, anxiety about what awaited him in the ruins of his homeland, and a strange grief at the approaching end of this unexpected fellowship with Anderson and Helen. Medicine had given him a temporary refuge from judgment, but reality waited across the ocean. Ingrid's name appeared on a December list, and the news hit Weber harder than expected. She had become his anchor during these months, the one person who understood the specific weight of their shared guilt and learning. They had never discussed it explicitly, but both knew they were being transformed by this experience, that they would return to Germany as different people than they had left it. On her final evening, they walked the compound perimeter in silence, breath visible in the cold air, both avoiding farewell until they could no longer delay. "We were taught that Americans were barbaric," Ingrid said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they treated us with more humanity than our own government showed its citizens. How do we reconcile that, Carl? How do we go home carrying this knowledge?" Weber had no comforting answer, only hard truth. "We go home and we tell the truth. We teach the next generation what we learned here, that medicine has no borders, that healing requires humility, that nationalism is a poison that corrupts everything it touches. And we never forget that mercy came from those we were taught to despise." Ingrid nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks in the winter air. They stood together until a guard called her name for final processing. She embraced Weber briefly, a violation of camp protocol that the guard pretended not to notice, and whispered, "Be better than we were. That is all we can do now." Then she was gone, walking toward the administrative building with Helen beside her, the American nurse carrying Ingrid's few possessions and talking quietly in the darkness. Weber watched until they disappeared, then returned to his barracks feeling older than his 43 years. The clinic felt emptier without Ingrid's presence, though Weber barely had time to dwell on her absence. A severe influenza outbreak swept through the camp in late December, filling the wards with fevered men coughing blood-flecked phlegm. Weber worked 18-hour days, administering medications, monitoring temperatures, trying to prevent the virus from becoming pneumonia in weakened prisoners. The smell of sickness was overwhelming, sweat and vomit and the sweet rot scent of lung infections. But underneath it all, the clean antiseptic smell of the clinic persisted, a reminder that they were fighting the illness with modern medicine, rather than medieval helplessness. Anderson worked beside him without rest, the older doctor's face gray with exhaustion, but his hands still steady. They saved most of the patients. Before penicillin, before this clinic, half would have died. The contrast was inescapable. On Christmas Eve, Anderson brought Weber a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a medical journal, the latest issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association, published just 2 months earlier. "For your journey home," Anderson said, "so you can see what we are working on now, what techniques are emerging. Medicine does not stop because the war ended." Weber paged through the journal, seeing articles on new surgical techniques, antibiotic research, psychiatric treatment innovations. It represented a world of medicine advancing, while Germany had been focused on destruction. The gap was vast, perhaps unbridgeable, but holding that journal, Weber felt determination rather than despair. Germany would rebuild its medical institutions, and he would be part of that rebuilding, carrying forward everything he had learned in this unlikely classroom. Anderson watched him with an expression Weber had come to recognize. Cautious hope that perhaps something good could emerge from the ruins, that perhaps the next generation might be different. Weber's name appeared on the February repatriation list, and he felt the jolt of it like an electric shock, relief and terror in equal measure. He had 3 weeks to prepare, though there was little to prepare beyond the mental adjustment of leaving this structured environment for the chaos of occupied Germany. Anderson spent those final weeks in intensive teaching sessions, cramming years of medical advancement into hurried lectures on everything from blood typing protocols to early cancer detection techniques. Weber filled notebook after notebook with diagrams and notes, knowing these papers represented knowledge that could save thousands of lives if properly disseminated. The Americans were giving him tools to rebuild German medicine from the ground up, and the responsibility was staggering. He could not fail them. More importantly, he could not fail the patients who would depend on this knowledge. The night before departure, Anderson hosted a small gathering in the clinic. Just Weber, Helen, and 2 other American doctors who had worked with the German medical staff. They ate simple food and drank weak coffee and talked about medicine, with the passion of true believers discussing their faith. Helen presented Weber with a box of medical supplies that somehow exceeded what regulations should have allowed. Penicillin, sulfa drugs, surgical sutures, sterile instruments, bandages. "You will need these more than we will," she said firmly when Weber tried to protest. "And you will teach others what you learned here. That is payment enough." The weight of the box was nothing compared to the weight of obligation it represented. Weber accepted it with a solemnity that needed no words, understanding that he was carrying forward not just supplies, but a covenant, to practice medicine as it should be practiced, with humanity at its center. The texture of Anderson's handshake on that final morning, firm, prolonged, heavy with meaning, stayed with Weber throughout the long journey home. The American doctor had given him a letter of recommendation, praising his surgical skill and dedication, written in English and German, so it could be understood by any medical institution. "You are a good doctor, Carl," Anderson had said quietly. "What happened during the war does not erase that. But it does create an obligation. You must be better than good now. You must be exceptional, and you must teach others to be exceptional. Germany's redemption, if it comes, will require people like you." Weber boarded the transport ship carrying those words like an anchor, understanding that Anderson was right. Competence was no longer enough. Neutrality no longer defensible. He would have to be actively, aggressively committed to building a better Germany, or he would be complicit in building nothing at all. The Atlantic crossing reversed was rougher than the first, winter storms tossing the ship like a toy, while Weber huddled below deck with hundreds of other repatriated prisoners. They were going home, but home no longer existed as they remembered it. The letters that had trickled through Red Cross channels painted pictures of devastation, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, millions dead or displaced. The country divided between occupying powers. Germany would need to be rebuilt from the ground up, physically and morally. Weber clutched his box of medical supplies and his notebooks, understanding that these represented his contribution to that rebuilding. He would open a clinic, train new doctors, disseminate the techniques he had learned. He would tell the truth about what he had witnessed in America, that the enemy had been more humane than the regime he served. That mercy was possible even after terrible conflict. That medicine practiced correctly, recognized no borders or political loyalties. They landed in Bremen on a gray March morning, the city barely recognizable beneath the scars of bombing and occupation. Weber walked down the gangplank carrying everything he owned in 2 bags and a battered medical kit, stepping onto soil that was simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. American soldiers processed the returning prisoners efficiently, but without hostility, checking papers and directing men toward transport stations. One young American officer, seeing Weber's medical insignia, asked in broken German if he was a doctor. When Weber confirmed it, the officer's face brightened. "We need doctors," he said. "Allied military government is setting up civilian medical clinics. They are looking for qualified German doctors willing to work under our supervision." Weber nodded slowly, understanding that his testing would begin immediately. Not whether he could practice medicine, but whether he could practice it as Anderson had taught him, with humility and humanity, in service of healing rather than nationalism. He accepted the officer's information, knowing his answer before the question was fully asked. The war had ended, but his real work was just beginning. He would spend the rest of his life atoning for the war through healing, teaching a broken nation that medicine, at its best, recognized only one nationality: human.